here's Brody Brazil.
So this video certainly is not a reaction to breaking news because the information we're covering here came out, like several weeks ago now. And even though I didn't get to it at the time, I wanted to make sure that I offered some thoughts and opinions and perspectives on the potential of the National Hockey League ever ending up in New Orleans. This is a city that's only hosted a couple small professional hockey teams over the decades, and now the thought of the National Hockey League ever even considering Louisiana, considering New Orleans, it's interesting, and there are some deeper level things to get to. First off, where did this come from? Kevin Weeks, obviously in and around working for and with the National Hockey League, he put this out on social media, so I certainly believe who it came from, but it almost brings me to the point of, well, why did anybody want this information out there? Was Weeksy leaking this? Was he told this on purpose so that he would put it out? But anyway, this is what he said in speaking to, and he names him, Deputy Commissioner Bill Daly and other sources involved. I can confirm that there was a recent meeting in New York City at NHL headquarters with a group expressing their interest in bringing an NHL expansion team to New Orleans. #HockeyX. It just sounds weird that way. I mean, it was Hockey Twitter. Now it's Hockey X, apparently. But again, like Kevin Weeks detailing that it was a group. We don't know who was part of that group or even really who is that group, but there was a group that met with the top dogs of the National Hockey League, and Bill Daly can confirm it, and Kevin Weeks is delivering this information. So certainly you can understand where it came from, but some immediate thoughts, and actually my first things I get to here have nothing to do with New Orleans. It has everything to do with just the overall thought of expansion and all the other cities involved in potentially getting a brand new NHL team. First off, the NHL recently said, the commissioner, Gary Bettman, said that they were not in expansion mode. So it kind of counteracts like a meeting versus what Bettman has said within the last 6 to 8 months. Those two things don't go together. However, a meeting is just a meeting, and if there was a meeting and that group expressed interest in doing something, okay, they met. It's not like the NHL is actually going to consider or move forward or be in expansion mode. They just talked about it, and that's fine, and we'll get to that in just a second. But the NHL has made pretty clear that right now is not their time to go beyond 32, which is a number they recently got to. And speaking of that, they just arrived at 32, which is the optimal symmetrical number all the way around. Why do I say that? 16 teams in the East, 16 teams in the West, 8 teams per division, 8, 8, 8, 8. That adds up to 32. You've got even numbers all the way around. And for so long, the NHL was misaligned. One more team in a certain division, one more team in a certain conference. And after they added Las Vegas, after they added Seattle, they get to 32. They realigned. They've got things as symmetrical as it can be, unless you go to 36. And if you get to 33 by adding, let's say, New Orleans as 33, although I think there are other cities in line to be before that, what about 34 and 35? And do you just go to 36 eventually? Does 33 mean you're going to go to 36? What about the Phoenix situation, right? The Coyotes were bought by the league, turned around and sold to the Smith Entertainment Group in Utah. Like, aren't they kind of still in the pecking order to get a team back? I know there was the offer to the Murillo Group. If Alex Murillo, the former owner of the Coyotes, if he produced an arena, he could instantly get an expansion team for Phoenix. Is Phoenix still high on that consideration list? And what about Cincinnati and Kansas City and Omaha? I think Gary Bettman and the NHL mentioned Omaha within the last year of being a potential NHL expansion city. And we've always known Houston was high up there. They've had minor league hockey at some of the highest levels for a very long time. So there are other cities in competition. And again, this is less about New Orleans and what about everything else that we know regarding NHL expansion. And then there's this from the Louisiana Governor, Jeff Landry. This came out, Jeff put this out on the day of the Four Nations final between the U.S. and Canada. Big game today, Jeff says, USA versus Canada. It's time Louisiana has an NHL team. The economic impact would be substantial, and having the Stanley Cup in the Big Easy would be a win for all. Now, there's one thing about this tweet. Maybe you've already kind of read into this. Maybe there's one thing that I think Jeff might be misunderstanding that the Stanley Cup Final isn't rotated city to city as the Super Bowl is, because New Orleans has had the Super Bowl 11 times as much as any other city on the face of the earth. But your team has to be in the Stanley Cup Final. And even then, you split games as the home and road team in the Stanley Cup Final. It's not like the Super Bowl where you can bid for it. You can have it at the Superdome or the Smoothie King Arena, whatever that's called next door. Anyway, I don't know that for certain, but that's kind of the way that I interpreted that tweet. In terms of New Orleans, we haven't really talked about this. It's weird because they feel like a big city, but they also feel like a small town. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. They just kind of feel like both. They feel somewhere in the middle. It's not Chicago. It's not Los Angeles. It's not New York. Not even Miami. New Orleans is just a little bit different. They have had an NFL team since 1966. The Saints are long established in the National Football League, and they had the Jazz first, right? The New Orleans Jazz became the Utah Jazz. Started in 74. They only lasted, 5 or 6 years? And then the NBA came back to New Orleans in 2002, left for a year, then came back for good. So they've had those two major teams. They've never had a Major League Baseball team. They've got 2 of the major 4 in New Orleans. They've also hosted 11 Super Bowls, tied with Miami, and a big reason for that. By the way, not all of the 11 have even been at the Superdome, but the Superdome itself, its capacity, its upgrades now, it just hosted the most recent Super Bowl a handful of weeks ago. They've done the biggest event in sports as much as any other city has across the United States. So they're tied with Miami for that. Again, they know how to do Super Bowls down there, but that's different than adding an NHL team, and I'll get to that in just a second. Their metro population in 2022 estimated at 1.485 million people, so not the biggest place ever, but I mean, look at like San Jose, California, and the Sharks have done very well over the years from an attendance and popularity standpoint. If you just look at San Jose, it's about that same number, maybe a million plus, but there's also the greater Bay Area, which is like another 5, maybe 6 total million people on top of that. So 1.485, not the biggest metro area, but probably big enough to support an NHL team. I mean, my goodness, if they can do an NFL team, fewer games, bigger stadium, I think it's somewhat comparable, but we'll see. I mean, they do NBA. We'll see how it would work for an NHL team. But that's kind of the thing here. They've never had a high-level professional hockey team for a very long time. The highest level they've ever had is the ECHL, and that team only lasted from 97 to 2002. And that's really it. There have been some iterations of really low-level professional hockey teams. The highest level they've had is the ECHL, and it only lasted 5 years. And that alone concerns me a little bit. And you could take it 2 ways. Number one, well, they haven't had a bunch of failures, so you don't know what you're going to get. But on the flip side, the one time they did have it, it was at that level, and it didn't even last. And it makes me wonder the popularity of hockey in Louisiana, hockey in New Orleans specifically. And I can't say for certain one way or another, and it's wrong of me to flat out guess based on, well, it's never been there, but there is no track record. There is no history. There is no understanding that this would be, well, a basketball term, a slam dunk. And that's kind of what the NHL needs to go to somewhere like this. They need a slam dunk. It seems less likely. Could this happen? That's kind of the big picture here. Could this happen? It seems less likely New Orleans does than other obvious markets. Houston being one. I mean, the Atlanta situation for a third time. Would they go back there? Phoenix for a second time. Phoenix, to me, makes a lot more sense. You already know it can work with the right ownership group and the right situation. But also in New Orleans, you'd have to not only sell tickets and be successful as a team there and as a business there, you also need to grow the game there, right? Because I don't know that you have a long-standing hockey community. You don't have a team that grew a fan base and grew a bunch of hockey fans in New Orleans. And that's what I was saying about the lack of the existence of a team over all the years and decades. If they had a team, they would simply have more casual hockey fans that are just residents of the area that would easily come out and support something like the NHL coming to town. So you have to sell tickets. You also have to grow hockey there. You need rinks. You need sheets of ice. Is this really something that's a possibility? From the NFL, from the NHL's viewpoint, There's also two schools of thought here, and I've heard this criticism of places like Atlanta, which, by the way, has already failed twice. I think Phoenix deserves another chance before Atlanta does, but those are retread cities. The NHL's already been there. But it's interesting, right? Because the NHL was already in Winnipeg, and they went back. It's not the first time that the NHL would be going back somewhere else. But sometimes I feel like this might be exactly what the NHL wants. Somewhere that's appealing, somewhere that they've never been. New Orleans, as much as they don't have any proof that this can be successful, it's also the element of surprise. It's almost appealing because it's like exotic. Kind of in the same way that Las Vegas was. You don't really know what you're going to get out there. They knew they had the right ownership group and private financing, and they had a lot of the foundational things in play, but residents versus tourists, how would this go? So you don't really know what you're going to get out of a place like New Orleans versus these other places which kind of have already a track record associated with them. But I do think that the NHL should listen to pretty much any reasonable market that wants to come in and talk and have a meeting, and any ownership group. And again, this doesn't mean that the NHL is moving forward with New Orleans. It doesn't mean that they've got any specific chance, let alone a better chance than another city in contention. It's just that a group from New Orleans or representing New Orleans with that interest met with the NHL in New York, and we'll see where it goes. I just think we are probably a handful of years away from the NHL going past 32. And when they do, I just hope that they have the overall plan, the bigger picture plan in place of how to get from 32 to 36, lay it all out, sequence it all out, maybe even pick your 4 cities over time and do it progressively. Don't just kind of do it aimlessly and lost. Like if you're going to go past 32, who's 33, 34, 35, 36, and in what years? I really do think it has to be that sequential. Let me know what you think about all this, the NHL in New Orleans. I keep wanting to say NFL now because I misspoke once, and now it's on my brain. Let me know what you think about New Orleans, potentially in the NHL or not, or somewhere else in the comments section. Also down there, hit that thumbs up button. Helps me, this video, and this channel. We got to end it. And also, no thumbs up. Make sure to subscribe to this channel down there so I can definitely see you next time. Whew.